The air on October 12, 1876, carried the first true premonition of winter. It was not merely a chill, but a crystalline sharpness that seemed to etch the outlines of the distant, black-toothed mountains against a sky of pale, unforgiving blue. In the fledgling settlement of Providence Creek, nestled in a high valley in the Montana Territory, this change was the harbinger of the annual siege, a time when the world shrank to the dimensions of a log cabin and survival was measured in cords of stacked wood. For Elara Vance, the change was a summons to a task the town would neither understand nor forgive. She was 17 years old, a widow before she had truly been a wife, her husband taken by a logging accident the previous spring, and an orphan long before that. Her presence in Providence Creek was a matter of inheritance, a small, sturdy cabin and 10 acres of land that clung to the valley's northern slope, property that made her both landed and utterly alone. She was a fixture of quiet sorrow and unnerving competence, a young woman who moved with the economy of someone who had never known a spare hand to help. The men of the town, men who measured worth in calluses and condescension, saw her as a ward, a problem to be managed. They had watched her fell, buck, and split her own firewood through the long summer months, a sight that elicited a mixture of pity and disquiet. They saw a child doing a man's work. They did not see the meticulous way she selected each tree, the practiced eye that judged the grain, or the steady, rhythmic efficiency of her axe. They saw only what they expected to see, a tragedy in motion. It was Silas Abernathy, the town's self-appointed patriarch and owner of its only mercantile, who first noticed her peculiar labor. She was not stacking her winter wood in the customary way, in long, neat ricks against the southern wall of her cabin, where it might catch the meager winter sun. Instead, with a heavy spade and a borrowed pickaxe, she was excavating a great pit in the earth some 20 yards from her door, a hole that was already, by his estimation, 6 feet deep and nearly 10 feet square. The growing mound of dark, rich soil beside it looked like a fresh grave, and in a way, that is what the town would come to believe it was, the grave of her good sense. Elara worked with a methodical fury that belied her slight frame. The ground was stubborn, laced with stone and the tenacious roots of ancient pines, but she attacked it with a grim persistence. Each shovelful of earth was a deliberate act, a step in a process she understood with an instinctual clarity passed down from a grandfather she barely remembered. He had been a trapper, a man who had learned the hard grammar of the mountains not from books, but from the land itself. He had learned to survive winters that could crack stone and freeze a man's breath in his lungs. And he had taught her the one great secret that Providence Creek, in its collective and complacent wisdom, had forgotten. The earth was a better guardian than the air. By the third day of her digging, her project had become a spectacle. Men would pause on their way to the timber stands, leaning on their axes and murmuring to one another. Thomas Gable, a burly man whose confidence was as broad as his shoulders, strode over to the edge of the pit, his shadow falling over her. "What devilry is this, girl?" he had asked, his voice a low rumble of amusement. "Digging a root cellar in October? You're a bit late for that." Elara paused, leaning on her shovel handle and wiping a sleeve across her damp brow. She looked up at him, her gray eyes steady and unblinking. "It is not a cellar, Mr. Gable. It is a cache for my firewood." Gable stared for a moment, then threw his head back and laughed, a loud, booming sound that drew the attention of others. "A cache? You mean to bury your wood? In the ground?" The absurdity of the idea was too much for him. He turned to the others who had gathered. "Did you hear that? The Vance girl aims to plant her firewood and harvest it in the spring." The men chuckled, a wave of derision that washed over Alara without effect. Silas Abernathy stepped forward, his expression one of paternalistic concern. He was a man accustomed to being listened to, his pronouncements on weather, politics, and providence treated as gospel. "Now, Alara," he began, his tone soothing, as one might use with a spooked horse or a feverish child. "We all admire your industry, truly we do. But this is folly. Wood needs air. It needs the sun, what little of it there is, to stay seasoned. You put it in that hole, and by the time the first snow melts, you'll have nothing but a pit full of rot and fungus." "My grandfather taught me otherwise," she stated simply. It was not an argument. It was a fact. He said the ground's warmth, what he called the earth's slow breath, would keep it. The dampness is the enemy, but you can shield from that. The air, he said, is what carries the killing frost and the ice. Reverend Miller, a thin, severe man whose piety was matched only by his certainty, adjusted his collar. "Child, your grandfather was a man of the wild, perhaps unacquainted with the proper science of things. The Lord gave us the sun to dry our wood and the good sense to stack it high. To bury it is to act against nature's own design, to invite ruin. It is an act of profound foolishness." She met his gaze. "Is it foolish to prepare for a winter colder than any we have known? The signs are there. The squirrels have hoarded twice the nuts. The bark on the north side of the aspens is thicker than I have ever seen it, and the woolly worms have no brown on them at all. This will be a hard winter, a wet winter. And wet wood, Mr. Abernathy, does not burn, no matter how high you stack it." Her words, born of an older, more observant wisdom, were dismissed as folklore, the ramblings of an untutored girl touched by grief. The men exchanged knowing glances. The poor thing, her mind unsettled by loss. They offered to stack her wood for her, to show her the proper way. Their offers were steeped in a condescension so thick it was nearly tangible. "No, thank you," she replied, her voice level. "I will see to my own preparations." She turned her back on them then, and with a grunt of effort, drove the spade back into the earth. The sound was a clear dismissal. The men lingered for a moment, shaking their heads, before finally dispersing, their minds made up. The Vance girl was a lost cause. For the next 2 weeks, from the thin light of dawn until the purple dusk fell, Alara worked on her cache. The project consumed her. It was a feat of engineering learned from half-remembered stories, a structure built on principles the men of Providence Creek had never considered. The pit itself was her first challenge. She deepened it to a final depth of 12 feet and squared its walls, making it a precise 16-foot by 16-foot cube of excavated earth. The physical toll was immense. Her hands, already calloused, bled and blistered anew. Her shoulders and back ached with a fire that sleep could not fully extinguish. But each new pain was a testament to her progress, a mark of her solitary defiance. Once the digging was complete, she began the second, more meticulous phase, lining the cache. She spent 3 days hauling flat, heavy stones from the creek bed a quarter-mile away, using a rickety wheelbarrow that groaned under the strain. She laid these stones across the entire floor of the pit, fitting them together like a crude but effective flagstone pavement. This, her grandfather had explained, was to create a barrier against the deep damp of the soil, a foundation that would allow any incidental moisture to collect and settle beneath the wood, not within it. The cost of the wheelbarrow's new wheel and axle was $1.15, a significant portion of her remaining funds. Next, she addressed the walls. Using a mixture of clay she dug from a deposit near the creek and dried grasses for binder, she plastered the earthen walls, creating a hard, smooth surface. She worked the clay with her bare hands and feet, mixing it in a shallow pit until it reached the perfect consistency. For 4 days, she painstakingly applied the plaster, smoothing it with a piece of salvaged board. As it dried, the clay shell hardened into a ceramic-like barrier, effectively waterproofing the subterranean chamber. This process was slow, demanding patience as each layer had to cure before the next could be applied. The town watched this stage with a kind of morbid fascination, their mockery now tinged with a reluctant awe at the sheer scale of her labor. They did not understand its purpose, but they could not deny the effort. The third phase was the most critical, stacking the wood. She had spent the summer felling and splitting nearly 10 cords of lodgepole pine, aspen, and the dense, slow-burning oak that grew in the lower valley. Now, she began to move it, piece by agonizing piece, into the prepared cache. She did not simply toss it in. She stacked it with the precision of a master mason building a wall. She laid the largest, densest logs of oak at the bottom, creating a stable and elevated base. She left small, deliberate air gaps between the logs, channels that would allow for the circulation of the dry, stable air within the sealed pit. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. Wood must breathe even in the earth. Give it room, or it will sour. As she worked, she sorted the wood by type and size. The oak and hickory for the long, cold nights went in first. Then came the faster-burning pine and aspen, perfect for quick, hot fires to boil water or cook a meal. At the very top, she placed bundles of fatwood and resinous kindling, wrapped in scraps of oilcloth she had purchased from Abernathy's store for 60 cents. It was a library of fire, cataloged and stored for the dark months ahead. Day after day, the woodpile beside her cabin shrank, while the subterranean hoard grew, a secret reservoir of warmth hidden from the sky. The final step was to seal the cache. This required a roof, one that could bear the weight of the coming snows and repel every drop of moisture. She used 4 stout pine logs as main beams, laying them across the opening of the pit. Across these, she laid a subroof of smaller debarked poles, lashing them together with rope and rawhide. On top of this sturdy frame, she stretched 2 large, heavy canvas tarps, which had cost her nearly $7, a staggering sum that represented the last of her husband's saved wages. She overlapped them carefully and secured the edges with heavy stones, creating a waterproof membrane. But this was not the end. Over the canvas, she layered pine boughs, creating a thick, springy mattress of needles that would help shed snow. And finally, using the soil she had first excavated, she shoveled a 3-foot thick layer of earth over the entire structure, packing it down firmly. She graded the mound of earth so that it sloped away on all sides, ensuring that any rain or melting snow would run off, rather than pool and seep through. When she was finished, all that remained was a low, gentle mound of earth in the middle of the clearing, and a small, cleverly disguised trapdoor, framed with timber and fitted with a heavy iron ring for a handle. The door itself was a masterpiece of frugal engineering, triple-layered with wood, oilcloth, and packed wool for insulation. The total cost of materials, including the nails, the tarps, and the wheel repair, came to $14.85, leaving her with a mere $47 in silver coins to last the winter. On November 5, 1876, the day she finished her work, the first snow fell. It was not the gentle, picturesque dusting of popular imagination, but a hard, driving sleet that quickly coated the world in a shell of ice. The men of Providence Creek nodded to each other, their faces grim but satisfied. Their wood was stacked high, the ricks forming long, dark walls against their cabins. They were prepared. They looked over at Alara Vance's cabin, bare and exposed, with no visible woodpile to speak of. Only that strange, funereal mound in her yard. They shook their heads in pity. The foolish girl had buried her salvation. The winter that followed was not merely hard. It was a malevolent entity, a living thing of ice and wind that seemed intent on scouring all life from the valley. The old-timers, men who had seen 20 winters in these mountains, admitted they had never witnessed its like. The snow began in earnest on November 19th and did not stop for 12 consecutive days. It fell not in flakes, but in thick, heavy curtains that erased the landscape, burying fences, then sheds, then threatening to swallow the cabins themselves. At first, the settlers of Providence Creek were unconcerned. They were hardy folk, accustomed to being snowbound. Their larders were full, their cabins were stout, and their woodpiles were immense. The fires in their stone hearths burned bright and hot, a cheerful defiance against the roaring wind. From his window, Silas Abernathy watched the snow pile up against the walls of his well-built home. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction. His preparations had been sound, his foresight impeccable. He thought briefly of the Vance girl and her buried wood, and a pang of guilt, small but sharp, pricked him. Perhaps he should have been more forceful, should have insisted on helping her. Now, her folly would surely be her end. The first sign of trouble appeared in early December. A brief, unseasonable thaw, lasting less than a day, settled over the valley. Rain, freezing as it fell, saturated the top layer of the immense snowpack. Then the temperature plummeted again, dropping to 30 degrees below zero. The world was transformed into a solid block of ice. The mighty woodpiles, the settlers' pride and their very lifeline, were now encased in a thick, impregnable sheath of ice, a glittering armor that mocked their axes. The outer layers of wood were fused together into a single frozen mass. Thomas Gable was the first to experience the full gravity of the situation. His woodpile, the largest in the settlement, stood nearly 8 feet tall. He went out with his heaviest maul, confident he could break through the ice. He swung the heavy tool with all his might. The maul bounced off the frozen surface with a dull thud, the impact jarring his arms to the shoulder. It made barely a dent. He swung again and again, his grunts of effort lost in the vast, frozen silence. After an hour of punishing, fruitless labor, he had managed to free only a handful of ice-coated logs. He dragged them inside, his confidence shattered. When he tried to burn them, they hissed and steamed, producing more smoke than heat, the moisture frozen deep within the grain, refusing to yield to the flames. Panic, a cold and unfamiliar guest, began to creep into the cabins of Providence Creek. The story was the same everywhere. The neatly stacked ricks had become monuments to their own uselessness. The wood was either locked in ice or, in the lower parts of the piles, soaked through with the meltwater that had seeped down before the hard freeze. The seasoned wood they had so carefully prepared was now as useless as green timber. Their fires, once roaring beacons of security, dwindled to sullen, smoky embers. The men began rationing wood, adding only a log or two when the cold became unbearable. The cabins grew dimmer, colder. Frost began to form on the inside of the window panes, then on the walls, then on the blankets of their beds. Reverend Miller gathered the faithful in his small, freezing chapel. He prayed for deliverance, his words turning to vapor in the frigid air. He spoke of faith and endurance, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. His own woodpile was as frozen as the rest, and he could feel the deep, penetrating cold settling into his bones. He looked out at the faces of his congregation, pinched and pale in the gloom, and saw not faith, but a dawning, terrible fear. They had believed themselves prepared, believed themselves wise in the ways of the wilderness. They had trusted in their traditions, in the methods passed down from their fathers. And it had all been for naught. Not one of them had lost a family member to the cold before. Not one had burned through their wood supply with half the winter still to go. And not one, not even then, in the depths of their growing desperation, would admit they had been wrong about the girl. They spoke of her, when they spoke of her at all, in hushed, somber tones. They assumed she had already perished, a silent victim of her own stubborn foolishness. It was a tragedy, they agreed, but an inevitable one. Meanwhile, in the small cabin on the northern slope, a steady, unwavering column of smoke rose from the chimney, a thin gray thread stitching the white earth to the white sky. Inside, Elara Vance was warm. The fire in her hearth was not large, but it was vibrant and hot, built from oak logs that burned with a clean, smokeless heat. The interior of her cabin was a small pocket of defiant life in the frozen world. A kettle simmered on the hob, and the air was filled with the scent of pine and brewing tea. The temperature inside was a comfortable 65 degrees. Each morning, she would don her heavy coat and mittens, take up a sturdy shovel, and make her way to the low mound of earth in her yard. The snow on top was deep, nearly 6 feet of it, but it was light and powdery, having been insulated from the thaw-freeze cycle by the thick layer of earth beneath. She would clear a path to the small, insulated trap door. It took her less than 20 minutes. Lifting the heavy door, she would descend the short ladder into the silent darkness of the cache. Down in the earth, the air was still and cool, but not cold. It held the deep, steady temperature of the subterranean world, a constant 40 degrees. It was a place of perfect preservation. She would select the wood she needed for the day, a few logs of oak for the night, some faster-burning aspen for the day, and carry it back up to the cabin. The wood was utterly, perfectly dry. It felt light in her hands, and when she struck 2 pieces together, they made a sharp, resonant clap. It was the sound of stored sunlight, the sound of life. It was the sound of her vindication. The crisis in the village reached its breaking point on December 18, 1876. A new storm, even more ferocious than the last, descended upon the valley. The wind howled like a starved wolf, driving the snow with such force that it seemed to pass through the very walls of the cabins. The temperature dropped to a level the settlers' thermometers could not measure. Inside his mercantile, Silas Abernathy sat wrapped in every blanket he owned, his breath pluming in the air. His fire had gone out 12 hours before. He had burned the last of his salvageable wood, had even started burning smashed crates and a spare chair. Now, there was nothing. The cold was a physical weight, a pressure that was slowly crushing the life out of him. His wife and 2 small children were huddled in the same bed, their shivering the only movement in the room. He knew, with a certainty that was colder than the air, that they would not survive the night. It was his wife, Martha, her voice a thin, chattering whisper, who finally spoke the name that had been haunting all of their thoughts. Silas. The girl. Elara Vance. Her chimney. I saw smoke from it this morning. Abernathy's first reaction was disbelief. It was impossible. She should have been the first to go. But Martha was not prone to flights of fancy. If she said she saw smoke, she saw smoke. A desperate, unthinkable hope began to dawn in his frozen mind. Folly. They had called her plan folly. But what if her folly was the only salvation left? Pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. Survival was the only currency that mattered. He struggled to his feet, his limbs stiff and aching with cold. "Thomas!" he rasped, his voice hoarse. "I need to get Thomas Gable." The journey to Gable's cabin, a distance of no more than 200 yards, was an epic trek through a polar hell. The snow was waist-deep, the wind a physical blow that stole his breath and burned his exposed skin. He found Gable in a similar state of desperation, his large frame huddled over a few dying coals. Reverend Miller was there as well, having sought refuge after his own fire failed completely. When Abernathy, gasping and covered in snow, told them about the smoke from Alara's chimney, they stared at him as if he were a madman. "It cannot be," Miller whispered, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "It is a trick of the wind, a phantom." "I don't care what it is," Gable said, his voice a low growl of desperation. He rose to his feet, a flicker of his old strength returning. "If there is a fire in this valley, I mean to be next to it." The three men, the leaders of Providence Creek, the very voices of its established wisdom, set out for Alara Vance's cabin. They were a pathetic procession, stumbling through the blizzard, their bodies failing, their pride already frozen and dead. They were united now only by their shared error and a single, desperate hope. The journey took them nearly an hour. They fell, they crawled, they helped each other up, driven onward by the primal fear of freezing to death. When they finally saw the faint golden light of her window through the swirling snow, it was like a vision of heaven. They collapsed against her door, their knocks weak and frantic. When Alara opened it, the warm, bright air that flowed out seemed to them a physical substance, a tangible miracle. She stood there, framed in the light, her expression unreadable. She was not surprised to see them. She had been watching their fires die out, one by one, for days. She had known they would come. Silas Abernathy, his face a mask of frost and misery, could not meet her eyes. He fell to his knees in the snow. "Miss Vance," he stammered, the words tearing at his throat. "Alara, we were wrong. We were arrogant fools. Our families, they are freezing. For the love of God, if you have any spare wood, we will pay you anything." Thomas Gable, the man who had laughed the loudest, stood behind him, his head bowed, his great shoulders slumped in defeat. Reverend Miller was openly weeping, his face buried in his frozen mittens. They were broken men, stripped of all their authority and pride, reduced to beggars at the door of the girl they had mocked. Alara looked down at them, at these architects of her isolation, and for a moment, the vast, cold silence of the valley hung between them. There was no triumph in her eyes, no hint of, "I told you so." There was only a quiet, somber gravity. She had not done this to prove them wrong. She had done it to survive. Their presence here was merely an unavoidable consequence of their own short-sightedness. "Get up, Mr. Abernathy," she said, her voice calm and even. "You will freeze to death out here. Come inside." She helped them into the warmth of her small cabin. The heat was a shock to their systems, painful and glorious at once. They huddled by the fire, soaking in its life-giving energy, their bodies trembling violently as the feeling returned to their extremities. She gave them hot, sweet tea, which they drank with shaking hands. For a long time, no one spoke. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind outside. Finally, Alara pulled on her coat. "There is wood," she said simply. "I will show you." She led them outside to the mound. With practiced efficiency, she cleared the snow from the trap door and lifted it open. She handed Gable a lantern and gestured for him to descend. One by one, the three men climbed down the ladder into the cache. When they stood on the stone floor, their lantern light fell upon the stacks of wood. It was a sight that defied everything they thought they knew. Walls of perfectly dry, perfectly seasoned wood, reaching up into the darkness. There were cords and cords of it, a fortune of fuel, a treasure of warmth, all resting in the silent, steady embrace of the earth. Gable reached out a trembling hand and touched a piece of split oak. It was cool and dry. He ran his hand over its smooth, grainy surface. He looked at Abernathy, then at Miller. Their faces, illuminated by the flickering lantern light, were a mixture of awe, shame, and profound, overwhelming relief. It was real. It was all real. The girl's folly was, in fact, a work of genius. "How?" Abernathy whispered, his voice echoing in the subterranean chamber. "How did you know?" "I listened," Alara said from the top of the ladder. "My grandfather taught me to listen to the land, not to the opinions of men. The earth holds its warmth if you know how to ask. Now, stop gawking and start hauling. Your families are waiting." For the rest of that night, and for the 3 days that followed until the blizzard broke, a steady procession moved between Alara Vance's cache and the freezing cabins of Providence Creek. Using sleds and sheer brute force, the men, their strength renewed by hope and the warmth of Alara's fire, transported the life-saving fuel back to their homes. They worked in shifts, guided by lanterns through the still raging storm. Alara directed the operation with quiet authority, ensuring the driest wood went to the families with young children first. She portioned it out fairly, demanding nothing in return. The fires of Providence Creek were rekindled, one by one. The smoke rising from the chimneys was a testament not to their own foresight, but to the wisdom of the young woman they had scorned. They had been saved. Their wives and children were safe, huddled around fires fed by the wood they had declared would be a pile of rot. When the storm finally passed, revealing a world transformed, a world buried under a dozen feet of snow, the settlement of Providence Creek was changed forever. Alara Vance was no longer the outcast, the peculiar orphan on the hill. She was the savior. The story of her earth cache and of the town's foolish pride became the founding legend of the community. In the weeks that followed, the town's gratitude was deep and sincere. Silas Abernathy waived her account at the mercantile for life. Thomas Gable spent a week chopping wood for her, replenishing her stocks for the next winter without being asked. Reverend Miller delivered a sermon on the sin of pride and the virtue of humility, his eyes fixed on Alara, who sat quietly in the back pew. He spoke of wisdom being found in the most unlikely of vessels, and how God often chose the humble to teach the proud. But Alara's vindication was a somber one. News eventually trickled in from other, more isolated settlements in the territory. The winter of 1876, which would come to be known as the Great Freeze, had been devastating. Entire families had been wiped out, frozen in their homes. Trappers and prospectors had vanished. The official count listed over 200 souls lost to the cold. They had all stacked their wood high, trusting in the old ways, and the old ways had failed them. Alara never gloated. She never once said, "I told you so." She did not need to. The simple fact of their survival was her testament. She had not sought their approval, only their respect for her right to follow her own path. She now had that, and more. She had become a sage, a figure of quiet authority whose advice on planting, building, and preparing for the seasons was sought by everyone. They had learned, in the crucible of that terrible winter, that true wisdom is not always loud. It is not always found in the majority, and it is often rooted in the deep, silent, and patient knowledge of the earth itself. The smoke from her chimney was no longer a sign of her peculiarity, but a symbol of Providence Creek's endurance, a reminder of the hard-won lesson that salvation can sometimes be found not by building higher, but by digging deeper.